Good evening, everyone, to the next edition of Basement Bible Study as we continue to make our way through the COVID-19 crisis. We are forced to continue doing Bible study this way. So I actually had recorded this about 4 days ago and then discovered that when I went to edit it into the software that I use to edit it, it erased for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but that happened. And then, as some of you may know, a couple nights ago we had to let one of our dogs go. He had reached a stage where it just wasn't fair to keep him going anymore. So that was obviously a distraction for a couple of days. The puppies, however, are doing well, full of energy and life and vigor. I think they miss Ducky a little bit. I know we do, but the kids are moving on and dealing with it. It's one of those tough life lessons that you got to learn. So, I did speak with Bernice today at our regularly scheduled Bible study on Zoom. I'm sorry most of you couldn't make it, but we did have a fruitful discussion anyway. Today we'll go over chapter 2, verses 12 through the end of the chapter, which I think is 25 or 26. And we'll cover that. We might also talk a little bit about it Monday when we hold our next Zoom Bible study. So all Mondays actually at 10:30 now. We're going to be doing the Bible study on Zoom. I will continue to record it on here for those of you who can't make it. And after May, I don't know what my schedule is going to look like, so we will have to see from there. So let's jump into Ecclesiastes. A couple things before we get going. I've said in the weeks prior to this that there's a lot of kind of behind the scenes stuff going on that's kind of theology nerd related, not necessarily helpful at that time to our discussion. However, moving forward, there is one aspect of that I want to discuss because I think it lends itself to this section a little bit. As we know, Qoheleth, or the preacher, here, up to this point, has mostly been summarizing the teachings and writings of King David of Israel. But mixed in with that is his summary of some of the writings of King Solomon of Israel. And this isn't terribly uncommon in the wisdom literature, to be writing from the perspective of more than one person, from my understanding anyway. But it's important for you to understand as we go through here, because there's a couple points that I'm going to be mentioning Solomon a couple of times here, and I want it to make sense for you as we go. So verses 12 through 14, let's look at that real quick. Starts out, "Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all." So here we are, the writer is continuing this kind of journey of trying to understand what the value of life is, what's important in life. Is there meaning to it? And as we get to the end of chapter 2, we're actually going to start to reach a conclusion to at least a part of that question. But here in these verses, he's considering the difference between being a person of wisdom or being a fool. And the problem that he sees is that at the end of the day, both the wise man and the foolish man end up with the same fate. The same event happens to them all in verse 14. And that event, of course, is dying. Now, for the first couple sections here in this edition of the Bible study, we're going to be talking a lot about death. It's going to be a bit morose, but I'm going to ask you to hang with me. Because like I said, he does start to reach a conclusion on this question towards the end of the chapter, and I think it's one that's worth hanging out for. The other thing he's looking at here is a successor. And this is where he's writing from the perspective of Solomon, and that's why I mentioned that earlier. He says, "For what can the man do who succeeds the king?" Now, Solomon would have been considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, king of Israel. He certainly would have been among the wealthiest, again, if not the most wealthy. So he says, "For what can the man do who succeeds the king?" Who could succeed King Solomon, and what could he do more? His conclusion is only what he has already done. The idea being that there's just no chance that he could do better than Solomon. But the writer does go on to conclude at least that wisdom still is better than being foolish. He says, "I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness." So while they may end up at the same place, and he may not hope to exceed Solomon, it's still better to be wise than stupid. I think we can probably all agree with that. He continues exploring the similar fate of the wise man and the fool. In verse 15, he writes, "So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity." And that's getting back to the theme we've had a couple times now of ending up at the same place, and how some things, some knowledge is really not that important. You can't really take it with you. We're going to start to expand on that as we go through this chapter, though. So, like I said, hang with me. In verse 16, he writes, "For there is no more remembrance of the wise man than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind." This kind of feels like a little bit of teen angst here. It kind of feels like he's feeling sorry for himself. But as I read this, I'm reminded of having read a book by Tolstoy called Confessions, and it's about his conversion to the Christian faith. And he went kind of through a similar experience. He kind of felt, well, what's the point of life if we're all going to die? Why bother trying if we're all going to end up at the same place? Tolstoy realized eventually that there was value to life, and that intrinsic value came from a creator, and that, I think, I'm paraphrasing, and I haven't read in a few years, but I think that value placed upon him by the Creator also led him to the realization that the Creator wanted him to survive physical death, and that's part of what led him to the Christian faith. Tolstoy is a tough read. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it, but in this case, he seems to be going along the same lines as Koleth here. Where are we? He continues in that verse, "And they, the dead, have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten." Again, kind of feels like a little bit like teenager angst, because obviously we remember Solomon many thousands of years later. But it just kind of describes what he's going through. I'm just scrolling through here. Looks like the chapter goes to 23. The last section I want to talk about is fairly long, so bear with me and then we'll break it down. Verse 18, "Then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity, and a great evil. For what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart, with which he has toiled under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome, Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. I misspoke. This isn't the end of the chapter, but there is a little more to it. So in this part, Koheleth is starting to look at it and say, look, all of this thing I've created, and again, he's writing, we're pretty sure he's writing from the perspective of Solomon. So Solomon really is saying, I've created all of this. I have built this kingdom up to what it is. I have this wonderful palace. I have all these riches. Israel is prosperous and powerful. I've succeeded in everything I've tried, and yet I'm going to die. And what is the value in everything that's been created if it's handed off to somebody who will ruin it? And this is where I start to think that the message starts to kind of sink in, at least with me a little bit. You know, it's about, he's starting to think about his legacy here. And I think that's something that we all have to think about. Not specifically as Christians, but in a way, that's a big part of it. What is he handing off here? What is he handing off, and what does that make us think about what we're handing off? When I look at this, I think about my own family and my role as a father. And I would suggest that any parent think the same way. And not necessarily parents, but people who are making an impact on other people in the world. But specifically as a parent, because that's how I think of it. I'm thinking to myself, I could work really, really hard, make lots and lots of money, and leave money to my kids. I could even do that to the point where I neglect my children, where I don't spend time with them, where I don't build up the intrinsic values and principles in them that I think are important. But at the end of the day, I'll still die. I'll be gone. Eventually they'll die, and they'll be gone. And the money will get spent, and it will be gone. So really, it didn't have any value. I would end up missing all that time with my family in order to build this thing that eventually is going to be gone. But if I, as a father, can instill good principles, good values, and faith in my kids, then those are things that are lasting. Those are things that will continue on for generations. Moreover, if I can make my kids wise, then that wisdom will continue. So while I may never have the kingdom that Solomon had, and I'll certainly never be a king, I can still learn from his message here and understand that the things that I take time to toil in need to be the things that are going to last. Otherwise, it's all vanity, it's all fleeting, and it doesn't matter. And I think that's an important message for all of us, especially in times like this that kind of make us think a little bit more about the fragility of life. So I'm going to scroll a little more here. I'm doing this kind of off the cuff out of my commentary. So it's kind of broken up in a couple of different ways. So here in verse 24, we finally start to reach the really bright spot. Koheleth starts to come around. Verse 24 and 25. Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Now those two sections are actually broken down in my commentary, and there's two things I'd like to mention about them. For verses 24 through 25, Koheleth is finally realizing that happiness is not a sin. It's not a bad thing, and to enjoy good food and good drink is not a bad thing. It's not a sin. To take satisfaction from your labor is certainly not a sin. The sin comes in when you put those things above everything else. Like I said before, my going to work to earn a living for my family is certainly not a bad thing. If I decide to work all the time and neglect my family for love of money, then work has become a bad thing. And the same can be said about pretty much anything we take pleasure in. If we have a drink at the end of the evening once in a while, that's certainly not a bad thing. If we have 5 or 6 drinks every night, we got a problem. Same with eating. Same with anything. Really, moderation is the key, and keeping your eye on what is important when you're doing these things. So he's reaching the conclusion here that some of these things really aren't vanity. There is value in them. And part of that value is that they are created by God. This also I saw was from the hand of God. We don't take pleasure in things just because. We take pleasure in things because God allows us to. And I think that's really important to remember. Verse 26 says, "For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind." I just want to touch on this really briefly and just for a minute. My concern when I read this is this could be taken as some sort of endorsement of the idea of a prosperity gospel. And anytime I see that, I want to speak against it because I hate it. I really just don't like it. And I think people who preach it are charlatans and hurtful. So, just so there's no confusion on my feelings. Now, when Koheleth wrote this, of course, that's not what he's suggesting by any means. The problem is that anything can be taken out of context, and people are very famous for doing it in the Bible. Or from the Bible, I should say. It would be wrong to look and say that those people who are wealthy and healthy and even happy are necessarily good with God. And it would be equally wrong to say that those people who we consider poor, who may be suffering, poor health, that kind of thing, are not necessarily bad with God. We cannot look to those things to judge people's hearts, their faith, or anything like that. And I know everybody in this group knows that. But since this video is going out to the world, or at least a very small part of it, I wanted to make sure we touched on that. I think what Koheleth is writing here is that those who are good in his sight are also those who are blessed with faith, with a future of eternal life, of those things that matter, love and family, and all of the things that are really important, those treasures in heaven that are what matter. Enough said on that matter. I want to touch on one more thing before we conclude here, and that is the idea of reading Ecclesiastes and really anything from the idea that it is a foreshadowing of the good news of Christ. And Bernice and I had an interesting discussion on it today. Extra points to her for being the only one on the Zoom call, so the rest of you are all in trouble. Not really. But, you know, as Bernice mentioned, a lot of the Old Testament can be really hard to read. Not all of it, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily come off as really happy or really good. Certainly we all read Ezekiel last year, and it was pretty rough. And we just spent the first 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes talking about how everything is vanity and grasping for wind and empty and all those things. And even this last section talked about how everybody's going to die. Not the most uplifting stuff in the world. But I want you to think of Koheleth here as presenting the problem and foreshadowing the solution. And the solution is, I guess, twofold. One is realizing, as he did in verse 24 and 25, that taking pleasure in things is not bad. But the second is that we're going to change the equation here. The common denominator is death. But when Christ comes and dies for us on the cross and is later resurrected, I was going to say something else for a minute, but resurrected, As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, he punches straight through death and out the other side. He changes the equation for us. And so in light of that, we've got to look back on Kohelet's writing here and say, okay, well, what is not vanity? If we indeed can take certain things with us, or if we are building up treasures in heaven, as Christ tells us we are, then we need to think about what those are. The treasures in heaven that we can build up are built by our good works, by our love, our good deeds. We're not saved by those things. But those are the things that come out of the faith that we have. The treasures in heaven, I would say, is seeing those we love when we get there. So building the faith of those we want to see when we get there, pretty important. So I would just ask that as you go through this, and some of it seems negative, just try to think of it in the light of how Christ changed the equation. That's all I've got to say about Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Like I said, we will start meeting again on Mondays via Zoom. I will send out invitations for everybody. If you are having difficulty getting on with Zoom, please let me know and we can work our way through that. If you need anything in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out. And I know Pastor Agali is now in the office pretty regularly, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying feel free to reach out to her. Hopefully she's able to join us Monday and you can all meet her. Until then, I hope you're all well. Take care, stay inside, and stay healthy.